January 22, 1929, Chicago. The most violent snowstorm in the city's history had been raging for 3 days without stopping. Streets were buried under 2 meters of snow. Electricity was cut off. Telephone lines had collapsed. In the Little Italy neighborhood of Southside, hundreds of families were trapped in their homes and freezing to death. The city was helpless. Police couldn't reach them. Even the fire department couldn't move. But that night, strange things began to happen in the dark streets. Food packages, blankets, and piles of firewood mysteriously appeared at the doors of trapped families. No one saw who brought them. No one knew where they came from. When morning came, the neighborhood began to whisper. This was a miracle. But the truth was far more interesting. Because that night, Chicago's most feared man had executed history's quietest rescue operation using underground tunnels, and no one would ever know. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Because in upcoming episodes, we'll be telling other extraordinary stories that happened in Al Capone's secret tunnels. The storm begins. Chicago paralyzed on the morning of January 22, 1929. At 6 a.m., the temperature in Chicago was 20 degrees below zero, and when the snow started falling, no one could have predicted this would become the storm of the century. Meteorologists had forecast light snowfall, but by noon, the wind speed exceeded 90 kilometers per hour, and the snow was falling so heavily that you couldn't see 2 meters ahead. This wasn't just a snowstorm. This was a white hurricane, and it was determined to bring Chicago to its knees. By 2 p.m., the city's electrical grid began to collapse. First, the South Side neighborhoods went dark, then downtown, then the entire city. Telephone lines snapped under the weight of snow. Streetcars froze on their tracks. Cars were abandoned on the roads. By 6 p.m., Chicago was completely paralyzed. Mayor Big Bill Thompson declared a state of emergency, but there was very little that could be done. Even snowplows couldn't move, because the snow was falling so fast that cleared roads were covered again within minutes. Police Chief Morgan Collins called all officers to duty, but policemen couldn't even leave their stations. Fire Chief Dennis Sullivan ordered his teams to stand by because fire trucks couldn't fight through the snow. The city was on its own, and night was approaching. The temperature continued to drop, the wind grew fiercer, and thousands of families were trapped in their homes, shivering from the cold. The Little Italy neighborhood in Southside was one of the hardest hit areas. This was a poor district where immigrant families lived. The houses were small old wooden buildings with poor insulation. When electricity was cut, most of the stoves that heated these homes stopped working because coal stoves needed electric blowers to function properly. And even those who had wood-burning stoves faced another problem. Their wood supplies were running out. Most families had enough firewood for maybe 1 or 2 days, but the storm was now entering its 3rd day. Children were crying from the cold. Elderly people were starting to show signs of hypothermia, and mothers were burning furniture to keep their babies warm. By nightfall on January 22nd, the situation had become critical. The Red Cross tried to organize a relief operation, but their trucks couldn't move through the streets. The Salvation Army attempted to distribute hot soup, but had to turn back after 2 blocks. Even horse-drawn carriages, Chicago's last hope for snow transportation, couldn't make it through the massive drifts. The snow was too deep, too heavy, too relentless. And the temperature had now dropped to minus 25 degrees. Without heat, without food, without help, families in Little Italy were starting to face a grim reality. Some of them might not survive the night. The call. When a gangster hears a cry at 8 p.m. that evening, Al Capone was in his office at the Lexington Hotel. The hotel still had electricity because Capone had installed backup generators, one of the few buildings in Chicago that was still lit and warm. Capone was reviewing business ledgers with his accountant when one of his men, Tony Lombardo, rushed into the room. Tony was soaking wet, covered in snow, and breathing heavily. He had just walked 6 blocks through the storm, an almost impossible feat, because what he had to say couldn't wait. Tony told Capone about Little Italy. He had family there, cousins, aunts, his elderly mother. The neighborhood was dying. Families were burning their furniture, their doors, anything that would burn. Children were wrapped in every piece of clothing they owned, but still shaking from cold. The elderly were lying in beds under 10 blankets, but their lips were turning blue. Someone had to do something, Tony said, or by morning there would be bodies in those houses. Capone listened in silence. He didn't interrupt, didn't ask questions, just listened. And when Tony finished, Capone stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the white hell that Chicago had become. For a long moment, Capone said nothing. His men in the room waited, knowing better than to speak. Capone's relationship with Little Italy was complicated. These were his people, Italian immigrants like his own family had been. He had grown up in neighborhoods just like this in Brooklyn. He knew what it meant to be cold, to be hungry, to watch your mother worry about how to feed her children. But he was also a gangster, a man the newspapers called public enemy number one, a man the FBI wanted to see behind bars. If he helped Little Italy, he would get no credit. The newspapers wouldn't praise him. The police wouldn't thank him. He would do it in secret, or not at all. Capone turned from the window and made his decision. He called for Frank Nitti, his enforcer and most trusted lieutenant. When Nitti arrived, Capone's instructions were simple, but would require something extraordinary. Get every man we have. Load every truck with food, blankets, firewood, coal, anything that will keep people warm and alive. We're going to Little Italy, Nitti started to speak, probably to mention that the streets were impassable, but Capone held up his hand. We're not taking the streets, Frank. We're taking the tunnels, the underground highway, Capone's secret weapon. What happened next was a masterpiece of criminal logistics turned humanitarian rescue. Capone's organization had spent 5 years building and connecting a network of tunnels under Chicago, primarily for moving bootleg alcohol. These tunnels connected speakeasies, warehouses, safe houses, and various Capone-controlled properties across the city. The tunnel system was extensive, almost 15 miles of underground passages, and one of its main arteries ran directly under South Side, passing within 2 blocks of Little Italy. The tunnels had been built for crime, but tonight they would be used for something very different. Within 30 minutes, Capone had mobilized over 100 men. His warehouses were opened, and trucks were loaded with supplies. But these supplies couldn't be moved through the streets, so everything had to be carried into the tunnels by hand. Capone's men formed human chains, passing boxes and bags and bundles through tunnel entrances, down into the underground, where other teams waited to transport everything through the passages. The operation was military in its precision. Capone had divided his men into teams: transport teams who moved supplies through the tunnels, surface teams who would take supplies from tunnel exits to nearby houses, and coordination teams who mapped out which families needed help most urgently. The tunnels themselves were cold, but protected from the wind and snow. Electric lights, powered by Capone's generators, illuminated the brick passages. The sound of boots on wooden planks echoed through the underground as dozens of men moved back and forth carrying loads. It was hard work, exhausting work, but none of Capone's men complained. Many of them had families in Little Italy too, or had grown up in neighborhoods like it. They understood what was at stake. And they understood that their boss, the man the world called a monster, was doing something that the entire city government had failed to do. He was saving lives. The first tunnel exit point was in the basement of an old building 3 blocks from the heart of Little Italy. Capone's surface teams emerged from this exit carrying supplies and immediately faced the brutal reality of the storm. The wind was so strong it knocked men down. The snow was so thick they could barely see, but they pushed forward, moving from house to house in the darkness. They knocked on doors, and when frightened residents answered, they found packages left on their doorsteps: food, blankets, firewood. The residents asked who they were, where this came from, but Capone's men said nothing. They simply delivered and moved on to the next house. The Silent Angels, a night of mysterious deliveries, Maria. Benedetto was 73 years old and had lived in Little Italy for 40 years. That night, she was in her small apartment with her daughter Anna and 3 grandchildren. They had burned all their firewood, then burned 2 chairs, then part of a table. The children were wrapped in every blanket they owned, huddled together for warmth, but still they shivered. Maria was praying, asking God for a miracle. When she heard a knock on the door, Anna went to answer it, cautiously, because who could possibly be outside in this storm? When she opened the door, there was no one there, but on the doorstep were 3 things: a box of food, a stack of blankets, and a pile of firewood. Anna screamed for her mother. Maria came to the door, looked at the supplies, looked out into the snowy darkness, and saw nothing. "Mama," Anna whispered, "where did this come from?" Maria crossed herself and whispered back, "Angels." God sent us angels. This scene repeated itself across Little Italy that night. At the Rossi household, where Paolo Rossi was trying to keep his sick wife and newborn baby warm, a knock came at 10 p.m. When Paolo opened the door, he found a large sack of coal and a box of canned food. At the Colombo house, where 5 children were crying from cold, someone left 2 bundles of blankets and a bag of bread. At the Moretti apartment, where old Giovanni Moretti was showing signs of severe hypothermia, mysterious deliverers brought not just firewood, but also hot soup in a sealed container, still warm. Family after family received help, and not one of them saw who their benefactors were. Capone's operation ran all night. Teams rotated so no one got too exhausted or too cold. The tunnel system allowed them to stay warm between deliveries, to rest briefly, to organize the next wave of supplies. Capone himself stayed in the tunnels, coordinating, making sure every street was covered, every family reached. He had detailed maps of Little Italy, and he checked off each address as his teams reported back. By midnight, his men had delivered supplies to over 60 families. By 2 a.m., over 100. By 4 a.m., nearly 200 families had been helped. And not once did anyone see Capone's men clearly enough to identify them. They appeared out of the snow like ghosts, left their gifts, and vanished back into the white darkness. But the operation wasn't without risks. At one point, a police patrol, 2 officers who had somehow managed to get a vehicle moving, spotted Capone's men carrying supplies to a house. The officers approached, demanding to know what was happening. Capone's men could have run, could have fought, but instead, they simply handed the supplies to the officers and said, "These families are freezing. We're helping them. You can arrest us or you can help us deliver." The 2 officers looked at each other, looked at the supplies, looked at the house where they could hear children crying. One officer made a decision. He took a bundle of blankets and said, "Show us which houses still need help." For the next hour, those 2 police officers worked alongside Capone's men, delivering supplies, saving lives. When dawn approached, the officers left without taking any names, without making any arrests. They never filed a report. The morning after questions without answers, January 23rd dawned clear and brutally cold. The storm had finally passed, leaving Chicago buried under record snowfall. As the sun rose, Little Italy began to wake up, and people started to talk. Every family had a story. Someone had knocked on their door in the night. Mysterious packages had appeared. Food, blankets, firewood. All when they needed it most desperately. But no one knew who had helped them. Neighbors gathered in the streets, comparing stories, trying to understand. Some said it was the Red Cross, but the Red Cross said they hadn't been able to reach Little Italy. Some said it was the Salvation Army, but they had no record of deliveries in that area. Some said it was the city government, but city officials were just as confused as everyone else. The Chicago Tribune sent a reporter to investigate. The reporter, a man named Michael Stevens, interviewed dozens of families and wrote a story titled, "Mystery Angels Save Little Italy." The article described the miraculous overnight deliveries and included testimonies from grateful residents. But Stevens noted something peculiar in his investigation. Several residents mentioned that their deliverers, glimpsed briefly through the snow, were wearing expensive suits under their coats. Not the uniforms of charity workers or city employees, but suits. The kind of suits that gangsters wore. Stevens didn't write this detail in his published article, but he noted it in his personal journal. He suspected he knew who was responsible, but he could never prove it. FBI agent Elliot Ness also heard about the Little Italy miracle. Ness had been investigating Capone for years and knew about the tunnel system. He put together what had probably happened, and even had his men search some tunnel entrances, where they found evidence of recent heavy use. Footprints in the dust, discarded food boxes with Capone warehouse markings. But Ness faced an unusual dilemma. He was trying to put Capone in prison, but he couldn't exactly arrest a man for saving lives. When his superiors asked if there was any criminal activity to investigate, Ness had to admit there wasn't. No laws had been broken. If anything, Capone had done what the city government failed to do. Ness closed his investigation file and never spoke publicly about the incident. Al Capone himself never acknowledged what happened that night. When reporters asked him about the Little Italy miracle, he claimed ignorance. "I don't know anything about it," he said. Maybe it was Santa Claus. His men never talked about it either. There were no boasts in speakeasies, no stories told to impress women, nothing. The men who participated in the rescue kept it secret, and that silence was perhaps the most remarkable part of the entire operation. In a world where gangsters love to brag about their exploits, this act of heroism remained hidden. The hidden truth, why he did it. Years later, long after Capone was imprisoned, and the tunnel system was mostly forgotten, a few details about that night emerged. Frank Nitti, in a conversation with his lawyer in 1940, mentioned the snowstorm operation. According to Nitti, Capone didn't do it for publicity or to improve his image. He did it because Tony Lombardo, one of his most loyal men, had begged him to save the neighborhood. And Capone remembered what it was like to be a child in winter with no heat. He remembered his own mother's face when she worried about keeping her children fed. The immigrants of Little Italy weren't just strangers to Capone. They were reflections of his own family's struggle. But there was probably another reason too. Capone understood loyalty. He knew that the respect of a community couldn't be bought, it had to be earned. By saving Little Italy anonymously, Capone earned something more valuable than newspaper headlines. He earned the silent gratitude of hundreds of families. These families never knew for certain that Capone helped them, but many suspected. And in the years that followed, when FBI agents came to Little Italy asking questions about Capone, when prosecutors tried to find witnesses willing to testify against him, they found a neighborhood that suddenly had very poor memories. Capone? Never saw him. Don't know anything about him. The snowstorm rescue didn't make Capone a hero, but it made him untouchable in Little Italy. The financial cost of the operation was substantial. Capone spent an estimated $20,000 that night on supplies and logistics, equivalent to about $350,000 today. For a man who made millions from bootlegging, it wasn't a devastating expense, but it wasn't trivial either. Capone never tried to recoup the money, never expected anything in return. The operation was pure expense with no financial benefit. But perhaps that's what made it remarkable. In a life built on profit and self-interest, Capone did something that was simply uncomplicatedly good. The legacy, a story that Chicago forgot. The 1929 snowstorm rescue became a ghost story in Chicago history. It happened. Hundreds of people experienced it, but there's no official record of who was responsible. City archives contain reports of the storm itself, the deaths, the damage, the paralysis of the city. But the Little Italy rescue appears only in fragments, a Tribune article about mystery helpers, a few diary entries from residents, Elliot Ness's closed investigation file, and of course the rumors. For decades after, old-timers in Little Italy would tell younger generations about the night when angels came through the snow. Some believed it literally, others knew better, but kept the secret. The tunnel system that made the rescue possible was gradually sealed off after Capone went to prison. The entrances were bricked up, the passages forgotten. By the 1950s, most Chicagoans didn't even know the tunnels existed. But in Little Italy, certain families remembered. They remembered the impossible deliveries, the mysterious benefactors, the night when someone powerful enough to help actually did. And when those families talked about Al Capone in private, away from reporters and police, their tone was different from the rest of Chicago. They didn't call him a monster, they called him complicated. The truth is that people, even criminals, are never just one thing. Al Capone was a bootlegger, a murderer, a tax evader. But he was also a man who once spent a freezing night coordinating a rescue operation, who moved supplies through tunnels to save families he would never meet, who committed an act of pure altruism and then kept it secret. These contradictions don't cancel each other out. Capone's good deed doesn't erase his crimes, and his crimes don't erase his good deed. They coexist, complicated and true, like the man himself. Today, very few people know this story. It's not taught in schools, not mentioned in documentaries about Capone. If you visit Chicago and take a gangster tour, they'll tell you about the St. Valentine's Day massacre, about Capone's empire, about his eventual imprisonment. They won't tell you about January 22nd, 1929, when Chicago's most feared criminal saved a neighborhood. But maybe they should, because that night proved something important. Even in the darkest places, even in the heart of someone society calls a monster, there can exist a spark of humanity. And sometimes, when circumstances align, that spark can light up the darkness, warm the freezing, feed the hungry, and save lives. The snowstorm rescue remains one of Chicago's greatest untold stories. A night when the city failed its people. But one man, using a criminal infrastructure built for illegal purposes, succeeded. A night when the underground passages designed for bootlegging became pathways for mercy. A night when Al Capone, perhaps just for once, was exactly what Maria Benedetto thought she saw on her doorstep, an angel in the snow.